Alright, and welcome to the final video in this particular chapter. Now we're going to be looking at what goes on in the brain and how we interpret that stuff. So, this is going to be very similar to the vision chapters, how we looked at, okay, we have the retina, where does it go from there? And you may remember it goes to the optic chiasm, it goes to the LGN, and then it goes to the V1, etc. Here, we're going to have kind of a similar flow, but each of these structures have their own particular purpose. So, from the cochlea, it's going to go to the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve is going to be going to the cochlear nucleus. And the cochlear nucleus is going to be a part of our brain stem. So we don't talk about the brain stem all that much in psychology because it's a very primitive, very deep brain structure. In other words, it's a lot of stuff like responsible for maintaining bodily function. Doesn't really come up all that much with behavior, but that's the first step here. We go from the auditory nerve down to the cochlear nucleus in our brainstem. So it's going to go down there, and then it's going to move up. It's going to move up to what's called the superior olive. The superior olive is going to be it's going to be where information from both of our ears combine. So, we'll talk more about this next chapter, but you hear a sound. Let's say you hear a sound coming from your left. That sound is going to hit one ear first, and then it's going to hit the other ear, right? And whenever that happens, we need to make sense of where exactly is that sound coming from. We need to make sense of where is it, or what is one ear hearing and what is the other ear hearing. Or if you want to think about it another way, you could have one person talking to one ear, one person talking in the other ear. How do you focus on which voice to listen to? That is going to take place in the superior olive. This is going to be where the auditory pathway from your left ear and your right ear are going to meet one another. And then once they meet one another, then they'll both go to their, both sides of the brain. So it's not the case that your left brain is only hearing, one part of, sound, and your right brain is only hearing one ear. Both sides of the brain are going to hear both ears. That's because it takes place at the superior olive. The next place is going to be the MGN, or the medial geniculate nucleus. And as you might expect, it is pretty much the exact same place where the lateral geniculate nucleus is. And so this is going to be the part of the thalamus, that sensory gateway, that is going to feed directly into our primary auditory cortex. So one of the things that we're going to see a lot for the rest of this semester is the thalamus. The thalamus is a sensory gateway, and what it does is it allows in certain information as long as you're quote-unquote paying attention to it. So, for example, if you are tuning somebody out, it's generally because your thalamus is blocking out that sound, is not letting that sound in. We see this a lot when we're sleeping, right? When we're sleeping, we can ignore a lot of the outside sounds because the thalamus is going to be mostly shutting down and not letting in certain signals. So that thalamus is going to allow certain signals to get to the primary auditory cortex, and the primary auditory cortex is basically for hearing exactly what the visual cortex is for vision. And just like the visual cortex was called the V1, the auditory cortex is called the A1. And so that is where a lot of this raw sound is really going to be processed. So it's a little bit of a trip to get there, but that's the flow of information. So just to recap, we have our ears, we have this information, all this stuff about the anatomy. It's going to culminate with the cochlea. The cochlea is going to send out things along this auditory nerve right here. This auditory nerve is going to make its way down to the cochlear nucleus, which is down here in the brainstem. That's going to transfer over to the superior olive, and you can kind of see here where we have the left and right ears, how each of these superior olives are getting information from both ears. From there, it's going to leak up to the inferior colliculus. Don't worry too much about that for this class. It's just kind of another part where this information is combined. From there, it's going to get to the medial geniculate nucleus, or the MGN, that part of the thalamus, and then from there, it's going to find its way to the auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe. Okay, so that's the roadmap. That's how we get from hearing things around us all the way to where our brain can make sense of it. So all these action potentials that really are created in the cochleus and traveling down the auditory nerve, they have to go through all these steps in order to make it to where we can actually process this sound. So again, it feels like it happens at the blink of an eye, and that's how quickly these things happen and how quickly these signals can travel across these different parts of our brain's anatomy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about psychoacoustics. Psychoacoustics is simply the study of how we perceive sounds. And we're not going to talk a lot about it this particular semester, but there are certain entire departments of psychology in other universities who this is all they study. All they study is psychoacoustics and psycholinguistics. That's all they study. So this is a huge area. We're not going to go into a lot of detail there because you don't need all that detail. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some of the greatest hits of these things. So, for example, one of the things that we're looking at right here is going to be looking at intensity and loudness as a function of age. And so what we're looking at right here is an audibility threshold that this is kind of at the very best, what the human ear and the human brain can process of hearing. And so you can kind of see here, just like in the previous graph that we looked at in the first video, that these really low frequencies, they need to be played very, very loudly in order for us to be able to hear them. On the other hand, as these pitches get higher, we don't need them to be as loud for us to be able to hear them. There comes a point where it gets so high-pitched that we start losing our ability to hear those things until ultimately we can't hear them any longer. So, at best, this is where we are. But as we get older, what happens is that this audibility threshold basically just gets higher and higher. In other words, our sensitivity to these different pitches overall gets worse and worse and worse. This happens naturally with age. And so you can kind of see up here, this 90-year-old, just for example, can no longer hear these higher pitches. That is just a function of how the ear works. But let's take a look at why exactly that happens. So, hearing loss can be created through a couple of different ways. One way, which can be temporary, is that it's simply obstructed by something. So, for example, maybe you have too much earwax, maybe you have a foreign object in your ear, maybe a piece of hard candy or something like that in your ear, and that can cause you to not be able to hear things. If you put some earplugs in your ear, you're not able to hear things. It's because this obstructing the ear canal is preventing those sound waves to further vibrate throughout your ear canal. Those things can generally be fixed, especially if it's just a buildup of earwax or something like that. On the other hand, the other two is conductive hearing loss and common hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss is whenever we experience hearing loss because there's been some kind of damage to the bones in the middle ear. This is something that is incredibly hard to deal with because basically your eardrum is still working, but the bones that help carry sound from the eardrum to the cochlea have been damaged in some way, and so that sound can't quite get there. For example, the video that you may watch at the very beginning of this PowerPoint with the young woman who has her hearing restored, a lot of that is through conductive hearing loss. What happens is that she lost some of the ability to carry that signal to the cochlea. And so what she has is basically an implant that helps power and send signals directly to the cochlea, thereby kind of circumventing these middle ear bones. And usually these can be damaged through ear infections and things like that. Sometimes certain fevers can destroy these things, different kinds of autoimmune disorders as well. In common hearing loss, this is something that all of us are going to experience, and it is permanent. That common hearing loss is through damage to the hair cells. So think about the hair cells. They're in your cochlea, and you have the tectorial membrane, right? That's rubbing up against those hair cells. Those hair cells, they're mechanical. In other words, they respond by bending. But like anything else, they can only bend so much. So for example, if I have, this sheet of paper and I continually push it just a little bit, this little business card, this little sheet of paper will last, right? It'll be fine. But let's say that if I did this for a couple of years, then it would lose its elasticity. It would not be as responsive. But let's say that I had this same business card and I continually pushed it really hard just throughout the day. You can already see how this particular business card is kind of already bent, right? And so having it bent like that is not good. Our hair cells are exactly the same way. And so if we bend these hair cells too much and too continuously, too loudly, they're just no longer as responsive. And so it requires louder and louder amounts of volume in order to make that hair cell bend. It's bad news, right? And so that comes with exposure to noise. And so for me, for example, I already told you how like my eardrums ruptured whenever I was young. That's that's fine. But matters were not made better whenever I was really young and I played in a lot of like rock bands and I listened to a lot of loud music. And I remember people telling me, "Oh, you're going to ruin your ears." It actually does ruin your ears. And now, I am constantly asking my wife to repeat herself because I just can't hear what she's saying. So it is permanent. It does happen with excessive exposure to noise. So that's just my fancy way of saying that if you tend to listen to things loudly and you can manage to have it played a little bit less loud, try to do that because that will help you in the long run in maintaining your hearing. Here we're looking at, this is a fascinating study that was done looking at people who lived in an isolated island environment versus people who lived in an industrialized society. And so what you're looking at right here is the effects of exposure to noise. And so the never left bit right here, this is people who lived on an island community that didn't have jackhammers, didn't have cars, didn't have electricity. This is their hearing threshold if they never left. So if they never left, you can kind of see how it stays pretty good, right? But simply moving away for 3 to 5 years, so they moved to America for 3 to 5 years as an example, and they moved back. You can already see that it's already dropped their levels of hearing. If they moved away for 5 years, you can see that it's dropped even more. And so the reason why this happens is because we're exposed to loud noises all the time. Anytime you're putting in these earbuds, these headphones, that is excessive exposure to noise. Being around traffic, being around television, being around, already said cars, being around, stadiums. All of these things are not good for our hearing. But we do them anyways because we've kind of incorporated them to our daily society, right? And so, the best thing I can just suggest is just, if you can, cut it out of your noise diet, try to do that. Here, you're looking at the effects of aging, so very similar to another graph that we looked at how as we get older, our hearing threshold gets worse, just through common hearing loss. One of the final things that I want to talk about is hearing aids. There are a number of different hearing aids and hearing implements that people can use. The electronic hearing aid is one of the most common ones, and the electronic hearing aid is I feel like over the past few years it's really gotten more advanced. Growing up, I remember whenever people would have hearing aids, they'd be kind of these big kind of blocky things that you could see sticking out of people's ear canals. People still have those, but I feel like today they have more, they're kind of behind the ear and they wrap down into a smaller nodule that's buried in the ear canal. So those electronic hearing aids, which I'm sure you've seen before, they don't amplify sound universally. Instead, these particular hearing aids amplify certain ranges of sounds, and specifically they are amplifying the sound of normal conversational pitches. So in other words, If you were to play something like, I don't know, like a dog whistle or something like that, it's not going to cripple somebody who has a hearing aid, because that's not going to be one of the sounds that those hearing aids typically are going to amplify. Instead, it's going to be amplifying mostly the ones that are conversational, that deal with speech, because those are the ones that are in some ways most important for people that have hearing loss. And then finally we have the cochlear implants. Cochlear implants, again, we've made huge strides in these in the past several years. These things are still incredibly expensive. And so usually what happens is that we have these implants that correspond to a speaker on the side of your head or clipped onto your shirt. And from there, those electrodes are going to go through the cochlea and basically attach straight to different parts of the cochlea, sometimes straight to the auditory nerve itself. And so these basically work by electrically stimulating different parts of the cochlea or the auditory nerve to generate the perception of sound. Now, whenever I say that it's really expensive, this is really, really expensive. And just to give you an idea of how expensive it is, the young woman that you saw who regained the ability to hear after 2 decades of not having the ability to hear, she had to start a Kickstarter to help, or a GoFundMe, I think it was, to help buy one of the batteries to power that implant. The battery was like $8,000. So these things are very, very expensive, and so they're not available to everybody for those reasons. And even then, people that have hearing loss, just because you have hearing loss doesn't mean the cochlear implant can work. Sometimes damage to hearing can come from damage to or lesions in the primary auditory cortex as well. But we'll talk more about that in Chapter 11. So that's all that I wanted to cover for this particular chapter. The next chapter is going to be how we hear things around us. So basically depth perception, but for hearing. So I will see you there. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't have anything witty to say. I'll see you later. Bye.